All right, Unit 3 now, and Unit 3 is the Roaring Twenties and the 1930s, where we're going to have the Great Depression. The Roaring Twenties are going to fall on the heels of World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, the Spanish flu. Again, we're looking at a devastation of an entire generation. And Americans are exhausted after World War One. The world is exhausted. We've seen death and carnage like never before. That's followed by the heels of the Spanish flu, as I mentioned numerous times. 60 million people dead, 600,000 die in America. 100,000 died in World War One, 117,000, another 204,000 are wounded. So there's a lot of death and carnage. So Americans come back from the war and they look to returning to just going to work and having normalcy, being normal. And three trends are going to come from this. People are going to move back into the idea of isolationism. We don't really want to listen to anything that Europe's doing. We don't really care. We don't want our presidents caring. We want to get back to living and having a family. The reassurance or the belief of nativism, and that we're suspicious of these people coming in from foreign-born countries. We want our job back. We want to go back to work. And again, these people that are coming from Europe that are taking jobs away from us that have been living here in the United States, American citizens, we tend to look at them critically. Labor unions were a part of that. And then the last one is a trend to become more politically conservative. We're going to have the uh, 19th Amendment is going to be put in place. Excuse me, the 18th Amendment, which is we're going to do away with alcohol. It'll be repealed by the 21st. But we go back to a second great awakening. Church and going to church becomes a bigger portion to Americans. In addition to that, America sees the Red Scare, and the Red Scare is the communist revolution of 1919, where Russia, the Tsar, is overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks and communism wants a worldwide revolution. And this worldwide revolution takes a while for us to understand it here in America. We are kind of indifferent towards what's going on in Russia. We have completely no idea what it is that this Russian revolution is advocating, but the idea with the worldwide revolution is that workers would one day rise up against owners, and that the haves would be overthrown by the have-nots, and then we would replace that system of capitalism with communism, where we all share in the spoils. There was a study that was done that we saw that upwards to 70,000 American radicals had joined the Communist Party. And again, to fuel that second thought that nativism would be endorsed by Americans, a lot of these radicals, these anarchists, were going to be coming from Europe, and they were going to become radicals because they weren't being accepted into America. They were looked down upon because of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. We really have a very small faction of this, but 0.1% of Americans, very small faction. But again, as I've said to you before, if you say we only have 1% of radicals in our country of 330 million, that's 3 million, right? 3,300,000. If you have 1% of radical Islamic terrorists in a world with 1.7 billion Muslims, then you're looking at 170 million people. So 1% can be a whole lot. And I would preface, and I would tell you, unless, but I could be wrong with my math, but I think I'm on that we should be alert and be prepared for people that are willing to blow up your family and blow up schools. Um, this is going to be, even magnified, like in New York when we watched the movie No God, No Master, where we're going to see these anarchists trying to kill prominent members of our business society and of our government. Um, Fearing the communists would try to take over America, you saw the government itself try to take a proactive approach. But the line that the government and Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General Mitchell Palmer tried to go down was to target all immigrants and say all immigrants are bad. I think that's a line that can be used against Mr. Trump. Potentially, is it that he's that way? That's for you to decide. But there has been people that have said that he's saying that all people that are come to America are bad. And Mr. Trump, on the other side, would say, no, I'm not against bringing people in. I'm against bringing in illegal immigrants into our country, and I'm definitely against bringing in immigrants that are trying to kill U.S. citizens. Palmer, when he comes into power, and in 1921, appoints J. Edgar Hoover to lead up this new anti-radical division in the Justice Department, and this would later be learned to be the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And he will start rounding up who they call, quote unquote, the radicals. And these radicals will be, 10,000 different ethnic regions, typically Southern Europe. Again, the Bolshevik, or not the Bolsheviks, but the Slavic groups down there along the Mediterranean that they were going to be targeting. He's calling communists, socialists, anarchists. Some of them were. There's no question that they were that. A great many were not. They were put in jail. They were given sentences without a trial, and they were deported. There was a rush to judgment, and there was a belief among Americans that it was okay to do this because these guys couldn't be trusted in the first place. Question, stop. Could this potentially happen again in America today? And I would tell you that I do believe that underneath the right circumstances of some kind of tragic event happening in our country, that we could potentially see us suspend certain rights given to our citizens. You've seen this again in World War II with Roosevelt and Executive Order 9002, where we imprisoned Japanese American citizens that had never been to Japan, had no connections to them simply because they were Japanese. And so I do think that is possible that you could have this happen. Palmer had scared the nation into believing that there was a communist plot to overthrow the government on May 1st of 1920, when nothing will be happen on that date. Palmer is discredited and he'll be replaced. The Ku Klux Klan and nativism kind of go hand in hand. There is a rise of the Klan in reassurance that we're going to see in the 1920s. Again, you're going to have this come about. And what's really important that I think I get across to you guys is these are prominent members within the business and within a lot of the churches, especially in the South. So you have a prominent member in a small town that might be a good job, come from a good family, and he'd be a deacon within the First Baptist Church. And these Klansmen, the Klan itself grew to a sizable amount in America, and they resented mostly minorities. They had a great deal of resentment towards African Americans due back to the Civil War. And African Americans now have moved to the north with the Great Migration, and they feel threatened by these people coming in and taking jobs. Again, in capitalism, if I'm going to pay the lowest amount I can to make the most money. So if I can pay a minority less than I pay a white male, and I can pay a female less than I pay a minority, and if I can pay a child less than I pay a woman, and there's no laws against that, then I'm going to do it. And that's going to put the most profit in my back pocket. That is part of capitalism. And so there's going to be resentment coming back off that. And typically the Klan was anti-black, anti-foreigner, very much anti-Jew. One we don't think about today is anti-Catholic. Again, I think I might have mentioned this to you guys, that the election of John F. Kennedy in 1962 was as big a deal, I think, or close to as a big a deal as Barack Obama being elected in 2008. Catholics had never been elected, and there was a great deal of resentment towards them. The Ku Klux Klan was anti-union, and it supported prohibition. And the way we destroyed the Klan, this is interesting now, the way we destroyed the Klan, or the way we disbanded it in the 1950s, we allowed it to go along. By and large, our government did. But in the 1950s, as we became more progressive and we became more open to minorities, specifically black minorities, World War II will allow us to be no longer a segregated military, and we start to segregate schools, is you have to go into the South. I mentioned to you before that in the South, we had this prominent male white guy that might have had a really good job or might have been a government official or something like that, and he was a member of the Protestant church. And you had to come into that church, you had to come into that town, and you had to call that person out and call him the bigot and call him the racist and say that he's breaking the law, and you had to root him out. You had to call out the enemy. If you never identify who the enemy is, then you can't say that you have a problem. And that's one of the issues that I think President Trump was pointing out against Mr. Obama when saying, I'm not saying all Muslims are bad, but I'm saying the Muslims that are trying to kill us, that are radical, they're the ones that are bad, and I am going to go after them. So he went out and said, I'm specifically going after those people that are in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and those groups that are trying to kill Americans. Prohibition. Prohibition in the 18th Amendment. It was a clash. You had it was pushed through by the women's temperance movement. And they would say that, and I think you can make a real strong argument with this, that people make really bad decisions when you drink. And typically you can go to our prisons today and almost invariably, almost all these guys have either had an alcohol or drug problem. Usually well-behaved, well-mannered people that are going to church, strong families are not in jail. So you have a clash between small towns and big city America. And eventually the 18th Amendment will get passed. The law will state, now this is important that you hear this, the law states that manufacture or the sale or the transportation of alcoholic beverages was prohibited. I'm going to say that again. The law said it was illegal to manufacture or to sell or to transportate or transfer alcohol in any way. It didn't say it was illegal to drink alcohol. And so we'll still have within the Catholic Church and many of the Protestant Church the Eucharist, the forgiving of sins and passing of the wine and the bread that will represent the blood and body of Christ, the Passover, and that was still legal within church. But you could not, and you could drink alcohol on your front porch, but you couldn't buy it, you couldn't make it, and you couldn't transport it. The law was pushed by church-affiliated anti-saloon leagues, and it was helped along by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The problem with the prohibition was that, and I mentioned this just before, the reformers believed that it caused the rate of crime to go up. Domestic abuse was typically associated with alcohol abuse, and work-related accidents were much higher when alcohol was around, which are all still true today. Again, guys don't get in fights at 6 o'clock at night. They get in fights at 2 o'clock in the morning after they've been drinking a whole bunch. You don't go home and beat your wife at 4 in the afternoon, but you might go home and beat your girlfriend or wife at 1:30 after you've been drinking. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize if you're drinking on the jobs, you're probably more likely to get in an accident. Prohibition was much more supported by rural South, Christian-going West, and it was supported by native-born Protestants who in their churches opposed the use of alcohol. Where the problem and the failure of alcohol came from was that it was the enforcement of the law and how it was going to be overseen. The Prohibition Bureau never had enough people to enforce the law. They only had 1,500 federal agents. They weren't paid very well. And you just have too much land. You could not, we have 18,700 miles of coastline and inland borders. You couldn't track. People could go out and make a wine or a moonshine still out in the woods, and you just couldn't find them. And so if the school says you can't speed out of the parking lot, but we don't have anybody out there enforcing it, it kind of becomes kind of cool to be the person that kind of flaunts it. And I was out doing something, and you think you're really daring. And so because nobody was there to catch you, it kind of becomes the in thing to drink and to be flaunting it back at the authority, to the man. He can't tell me what to do. And so it's going to fail because of that. The counterculture that came out of this, as I'm mentioning, began to emerge for the following reasons. They were tired of making sacrifices. I'm tired of being told what to do after being at war. And if I want to enjoy life and I want to drink, I don't want to have some uppity person with a Bible throwing it at my face saying I'm going to go to hell. It's my choice. I'm going to do what I want to do. First of all, they didn't consider drinking to be a sin. It was just a simple part of socializing. And they really don't want government meddling in their own personal lives. They don't like government meddling in that area. What comes out of this is what we're going to call the bars underground. They were called speakeasies. These were hidden saloons where you had to have a password to get in or a knock to get in. It's where you're going to sell alcohol. They were almost literally everywhere across America. And if you knew the password, you got in. And again, it was kind of fun. It was kind of cool. It was regular people going, there's nobody that's going to really catch us. And so we're going to do it. Bootleggers were those people that smuggled alcohol into the United States, usually from Canada and from Cuba and from the Caribbean. They got, how are you going to hide the alcohol? So here you have a woman that is hiding her alcohol underneath her garter, underneath her dress. That's going to have the little flask there filled with some kind of hard liquor that she can have a drink of. In addition to this illegal use of alcohol, crime and organized crime is going to come about. And organized crime is going to see the effects of prohibition as generally something that they can exploit. You're going to see organized crime see this as a possible way of raising money. And you'll hear a number of people that say, if you just make marijuana and illegal drugs like cocaine or heroin legal, this is some of the people that are in the Democratic Party, mostly for marijuana, but some of the libertarian say just let drugs be legal. And if the guy wants to do drugs, then he becomes a junkie and he becomes a loser, and nobody wants to be that. So if you make it illegal, then you give crime a way of making money. So you want to get rid of crime, make drugs and alcohol legal, and then they don't have a foothold in it. I think that's ludicrous, but I'm not going to go into why that is, but I just think that's not going to hold water. People like Al Capone is going to become someone that people actually look at and marvel at, and they are fascinated with him. And Capone's bootlegging empire is going to be over $60 million a year. Now, $60 million a year in 1923 and 24, that's a bunch of money. Capone was a punk. He kills a ton of people and anybody that stands in his way. Eventually, he'll be caught for tax evasion, and he'll be thrown into prison. He'll be released in 1939, and he'll die from syphilis, ouch, in 1947. That's a really, really bad disease. We're going to stop there, and because now we're getting towards the end of the 1920s where everybody's living pretty good, but just around the corner, you're going to have the rich getting richer, and there's going to be a gap between the haves and the have-nots. You're going to have a high credit bill because everybody's buying on credit. And look out, because here comes the Great Depression. So we're going to look at that next.